First of all, thanks to everyone for coming. I know that some of you come from kind of far away. I know there's some interest from Cambridge, and I know some came from that far. But I know that everyone here is really passionate about change, innovation, disruption, all common things in the blockchain field. We have the pleasure tonight to have a UCL Dr. Gavin Wood. He has recently written the white paper on Polkadot, a new project on multi-chain in collaboration with Melonport, and we have the pleasure to have also Mona Isa, which has also a fantastic background in finance. Today we will cover connected consensus, so in general blockchain applications on asset management and other translational applications. So yes, thanks all for coming. This is one of the last events of the term for the student division of UCL Center for Blockchain Technologies. I strongly encourage you to push a like on our Facebook page and also to follow our website, which we can be coming on in a few days, and where we upload all the opportunities that we will have. Thanks, and let's give a warm round of applause to our guests.
Hi everyone, thanks for having us. Real pleasure to have with us Gavin Wood today, author of Polkadot. And we're very excited from a personal perspective, having founded a blockchain asset management software company. We're very excited about Polkadot from a personal use case, although I think Gavin's also going to mention to us or touch on all the other use cases around Polkadot today. I'd imagine that there's people here from all sorts of backgrounds, some more technical than others, so I think we're going to start with a little Q&A where I'll ask Gavin a few questions just about, around the space, and then allow him give him the floor to talk about Polkadot in more depth. So Gavin, maybe for the benefit of people here, it's not every day, people get to hear it from you yourself. I'd love to hear from you why blockchains are so powerful and where you sort of see the future in 10 years, 5 to 10 years from now in the blockchain space.
Okay, so actually just to get a feel of who's listening, can you put your hands up if you feel that you have a reasonable grasp of what a blockchain is? Okay, so about 2/3. So blockchains are quite an important technical development, which it's an interesting sort of point to note that most technological developments tend to take existing technology and make them in some sense better, so faster or bigger or whatever it would be. Blockchain is an interesting one in that it doesn't actually affect anything existing as technological, but rather it's actually it addresses a social issue. The social issue is very simple. It's one of trust. So if you want to do a deal with somebody, by and large, you need to trust them. You need to trust them. If you don't trust them, then you need to go to somebody else that you do trust, and get them to go to that same intermediary, and that will allow you to do a deal. And it's because of this necessity of trust for dealing that we have the society that we see around us. The society we see around us is full of institutions, for very large organisations, the government being very, very notable, banks, insurance companies, legal law firms, and so on. And these are all parts of society that facilitate dealing, and they're necessary because we need to trust each other. What the blockchain does is it facilitates dealing without trust. So it's a technological answer to the fundamental deliverable of each of these intermediaries. And as time goes on, so over the next 5 or 10 years, we're going to probably, actually 10 or 20 years, we're going to find that an increasing amount of society deals less with these intermediaries and more at that peer-to-peer level. And this general movement from centralization to decentralization is fairly, we see it throughout history. Right? Typically, we start with kind of nothingness, and then we get a centralized solution that allows people to do something. And then after time, the centralized solution becomes effectively commoditized and decentralized. And then basically we move on to the next level. And then the next level, you start with nothing, got a centralized solution now, and eventually it gets decentralized. Software development is a really obvious one to put. So in the 80s, software development was heavily centralized. It was mostly for hierarchies of organizations. But as underlying society and technology changed, the internet being a very notable one, we find that the software development itself, the process of software development, how we actually go about it, has changed from a very centralized model with IBM style, top-down, through sort of more GNU style, still fairly cathedral-oriented, but much more open, to the Bazaar style, where there's this kind of Linux in the mid-90s, where many different programs were getting together using mailing lists to actually coordinate, but there was still a relatively, things were still relatively centralized. They were centralized in pockets, but they were still relatively centralized. To something more approaching what you might call a GitHub approach now, where there's much more basically forking, which in the mid-90s was a terrible idea, is now actually encouraged. And the idea that there could be a project can have multiple repositories going along in parallel, and eventually they'll cross-pollinate each other and hold together or will move forward. So this is my sort of general belief that this is happening right now in society on the basis of trust. So this product of the intermediaries, which is to allow third parties to trust each other, to deal with each other, is something that will become decentralized through this sort of technology.
So I struggle with this a little bit in the sense that we all kind of hopefully can see how revolutionary this technology is and how efficient it can make lives and reduce costs. And we've seen so many promises thrown at us in terms of people promising to use blockchain technology to increase efficiencies or to manage inventories or better improve processes. And there's so much money thrown at so many different projects. Why do you think what do you think is kind of stopping any kind of big use case yet to be seen for blockchain technology yet? Is there some limiting factor that we're missing in the space?
So one of the simplest answers is just that it's very early, and it inevitably takes time for a new paradigm to find its feet. The fact of the matter is that since we sort of came out of villages and then formed cities, we've needed intermediaries in order to facilitate deal. Because we haven't been able to actually have a community where we know everybody, and trust actually wasn't needed because exile from the community would have meant an effective end of life. Now, since we live in cities, these intermediaries have come along, and we've lived like this for a very long time. So our society is very much geared around this kind of system. And it will take a while before people really get the hang of the notion that they can actually do peer-to-peer interactions that are trustless. So they can actually do value-based signals without actually having to go to an intermediary to enforce those signals at the end of the day.
Okay, and one thing that we struggled with as Melonport when we were thinking about launching our blockchain software for asset management was kind of if we commit to building on a certain chain, which we have for the moment, which is building on Ethereum, it seems to me that different chains are being created almost on a daily basis now. You have the kind of private chains the banks are creating, or various other industries are creating their own chains, and somehow it almost seems like the blockchain space is becoming very fragmented and very isolated. And it's always been a concern for us until we sort of came across Polkadot. But maybe you could just quickly touch on why you think there are so many blockchains, different blockchains being created, and what purpose.
Mm-hmm. So it follows on from the previous answer, I suppose. This is a very useful young field, and as such, innovation is huge advances in relatively small periods of time. Just since 2008, when the first sort of what we would call modern blockchain was released, like Bitcoin, we've seen vast amounts of development in this space. Dozens of different designs of blockchain, hundreds, if not thousands now, of different deployed blockchains. And in a lot of those cases, it's much of the same. But with the different designs of blockchains, they are tending towards attempting to address different domains. So examples here would be things like big chain DB, which is very much a data-heavy chain, so it's all about processing as much data as possible without necessarily doing all that much computation. We see Bitcoin, which is a much more, the oldest chain, and as such, what might be considered the most stable. And in fact, the core developers take the stability of Bitcoin extremely seriously. We see Ethereum, which is much more flexible, and has a slightly more liberal attitude to actually rolling out upgrades and trying to keep technology current. I could mention, another 6 or 7 of these, clearly kind of different design decisions. And you have to remember, this is still the first, very kind of early days, the sort of 92, 93, 94 of the internet era. So we can expect to see an awful lot more coming as time goes on. So I very much doubt we're at a period now where we're going to converge on a single chain. We do see an increasing number as more and more people get into the field, and as more and more research goes on, here as well as anywhere else. Then we're going to see an increasing number of directions explored, and according to increasing number of blockchains. So
this makes a lot of sense, and you see everybody essentially working on blockchains that suit their particular interests. And I guess the fascinating thing about Polkadot is it's a way to connect all of these chains together in sort of internet of blockchains that allows them to communicate securely or transfer data between them securely between one another. Would you say that's an accurate definition?
Yeah, so the thing about Polkadot is that it's designed in order to allow this kind of experimentation, this kind of explosion of different directions in the whole sort of blockchain consensus algorithm direction, without forcing this kind of isolation that we see at the moment, where it's very difficult for these individual trust-free communities to interact with each other. And that's the critical thing. So one of the great things about blockchain, about writing applications in Ethereum, for example, is the network effects. So the ability to actually interact with all of the other contracts, decentralized applications, tokens, or whatever it happens to be able to interact with them in a trust-free manner. So to be able to actually just deal with them without having to think about going to intermediaries and without getting gouged on middleman fees and so forth. Now, when different blockchains, when blockchains are deployed individually in an isolated fashion, as all are at the moment, you don't get those network effects. So individual blockchains will have great advantages, but there's no way they can talk to each other, except perhaps via an exchange in order to actually try and figure out token swaps. But this is very costly.
Well, it kind of takes away some of the efficiencies that blockchains are supposed to give.
Well,
all of them. Okay. Well, without going into too much detail, because I know you're about to show us some slides and maybe go into a bit more of a technical deep dive on Polkadot. I guess the one thing I would hope everyone would leave here understanding today is, well, 3 things. One, what is kind of Polkadot trying to achieve? I think we've covered that. So it's a secure intercommunication between potentially wildly different types of chains. And how does someone say, I have my own chain? And let's say I'm building this chain right now, it's a new chain. What are the sort of restrictions that, enable me? What do I need to do to be able to plug it into Polkadot and benefit from this whole network effect?
So this will, you're right, this will be covered a bit better in a few minutes. But in essence, what Polkadot does is it provides two things. So it provides the network effects, the ability to actually send transactions between these constituent members of the Polkadot community, these chains. But it also provides what we could call pooled security. So what it means is that these individual chains don't need to incentivize anybody to validate what's going on in the chain. So for example, the Bitcoin network mints however many, I don't know, was it like $1 million, $2 million worth of Bitcoin a day, in order to incentivize the miners, these validators, to go through all the transactions, execute them, make sure they're valid. And that's a substantial cost. And the point of Polkadot is to pool security actually in the Polkadot network so that the individual constituents, the members of the Polkadot network, don't need to do that themselves. And what this does is it means that we can scale substantially better. Because when you add a new blockchain, if it's just a legacy style of blockchain, then when you add it, you need to actually provide some security for it so that any dealings that go on can't be fraudulently altered or corrupted in some way by an adversary. The way that we do that typically is by minting creating this additional incentivization as part of some system on the chain, but that inevitably leads to problems with should the chain not in principle have difficulty attracting that level of interest. With Bitcoin, that's not too much of a problem, but then Bitcoin is very minimally flexible, so it's very difficult to add to it. So with Polkadot, what we've done, we said, well, why don't we create a system which at its core is very, very flexible, it's basically fundamentally flexible. In fact, the only thing it can do is be extended and say, well, we can extend it in many different directions by building what we call parachains, or parallelized chains, and allow these chains to process transactions independently, but have everything be audited under the main system, the underlying relay chain. And what this does is it means that we can scale out without compromising on security.
So basically, if I'm building my parachain, what I need to do is make sure that I provide the relay chain, or my ecosystem provides the relay chain with a proof of validity. And then the relay chain basically takes care of the consensus mechanism and the network for me. Yeah.
That's right. So effectively, in principle, but if you were blockchain researchers and you wanted to try out your new design for, I don't know, trying to make contracts in WebAssembly or whatever crazy stuff you want to do, then you would need to provide only one real thing. You would need to provide a single function which stated, given the input data, whether it was valid. Everything else would be looked after by the relay chain. So the relay chain basically takes care of coming to consensus of one of many potentially valid candidate blocks, and it also feeds you transactions from the rest of the Polkadot community and allows you to send out transactions to the rest of the Polkadot community.
So it acts a little bit like a post office, kind of sorting messages towards different destinations and then delivering them, and also the opposite.
That's right, and perhaps also a little like a notary, actually signing off on the eventually finalized or canonical blocks.
I guess there's one more thing I wanted to ask before you give your presentation. There's this concept in the paper about the dot token. And my understanding is that these are kind of a necessity for the proof of stake mechanism Polkadot operates by. So other than allowing you to perform this validating function, the dot tokens uses allow you to add, deploy, and modify which parachains are added to the network.
That's right. So the underlying Polkadot network, the underlying Polkadot protocol does need some means of ensuring that the participants who take part in the validation protocol are in some way staked into the system. So there needs to be a metric for measuring how much stake any individual account has.
I think we're going to let you.
Cool. So could I get some hands, a show of hands for like who is at least in some sense familiar with the basic basic ideas behind blockchains, things like transactions, signing, maybe hashes. Anyone? Okay, yeah, cool. Relatively technical audience. So this is both. This is meant to be a chat talk. I'm not going to go into too much detail over the sort of nitty-gritty of the protocol, as much as well-defined as it is. But I want to give you a reasonable overview of the key components of Polkadot and how they can come together to deliver the system that we've basically just kind of tried to outline. So we'll go over three very particular properties of Polkadot. First is that it's extensible. Modular, upgradable. Second is that it's scalable, and the third is that it's heterogeneous. So it's extensible. So the idea is that we can actually, as time goes on, even though it's been deployed, we can actually add to it. So if we say, it turns out that ZK Snarks, an interesting cryptographic technology that came out not long ago. It turns out that we've got a really nice, efficient way of computing these, and we're actually able to scale it out so that we can have more or less encrypted computation going on, or basically verify computation without having to know all of the data that's involved. And what we would be able to do is deploy a parachain, a component of Polkadot, such that all of the other existing parts of the system are able to utilize it or interact with it in a trustless manner. So that's more or less what I mean by extensibility. Scalability is essentially this notion of pool security. So the idea here is that we can, if we add new chains to the system, or new parachains to the system, so we have new components, we allow more transactions to be done because they're independent, that we don't compromise on security. So the security remains the same. Okay? And finally, the idea of heterogeneity. So many of or at least some of the other sort of systems that are being proposed, sort of changes in blockchain that fulfill maybe more on the other two components, are often homogeneous. So what this means is that all of the different parts of the system behave necessarily as part of the same, with the same rules. So certain aspects of the system cannot be made domain specific. So for example, if you have a very data-heavy application, then you would be, whatever parameters are necessary for your underlying technology, you would have parameterized it across the entire system, and you won't be able to do anything special in any particular part of the system. Okay? So the idea with Polkadot is that each of the individual components can be as different as you want. In fact, as I said before, there's a single function, a validation function, and this can basically do anything at once. Okay. So how do we actually get to these three very particular attributes? Well, the idea is that it provides these two very particular services: pooled security and the trust-free transactions. So basically, the chains themselves, the parachains, are able to validate the messages and consolidate into a finalized state without having to provide their own individual means of security themselves. Similarly, the transactions that go between the chains, you can trust, or you don't have to trust, you are guaranteed that the transaction, if it says it came from parachain C, from account 42 of parachain C, you know it definitely has come from there. Yeah, and you know that it's not going to be reverted or anything like that in the future. So I touched on this before. There's basically two components, or two types of top-level components to relay chains and parachains. So the relay chain is the thing that sits more or less kind of not in the middle exactly, but it's the thing that manages these parachains. Parachains themselves are the individual constituents of Polkadot. So these are the things that can basically run in parallel. They're more or less the same as blockchains, except they swap out one or two of the standard components of blockchains. So the basics of the relay chain is very simple. Relay chain has really no functionality. You can't use it. It wouldn't make a very good, means of currency or payment system or whatever. That's not what the point of it is. It's critically, it has no ability to process external transactions, so you can't send transactions directly to it. And it doesn't have any kind of smart contracts. Right? So you can't deploy smart contracts on it like you can in theory. Furthermore, fees are levied for the parachains to themselves move tokens between accounts on this relay chain and to take part in whatever governance structures that the relay chain has potentially built. The governance of the relay chain itself is something that we've come to any kind of final decision on, but it's likely to have some similarity to sort of present-day political structures to try and create some kind of stability over the direction of the network itself. Ultimately, of course, the stakeholders, which we have an accounting system to measure how much stake any particular account has, these stakeholders would have the final say, and referendum would be the means of achieving some direction based on it. So here's a slightly complicated diagram of the Polkadot protocol in action. Key things to notice are the fact that the relay chain is able to pass transactions between parachains. There are validators in the relay chain. So these are the participants which actually check that what's going on in the parachain is correct. Right? So they run through the transactions. Usually, in the normal scheme of things, they would run through the transactions in the parachain, check that they've been executed correctly, and sign up. And together they would form a consensus over which particular blocks each parachain had, and that would be committed as part of the history of the relay chain. The validators themselves don't stay with any particular parachain for very long, so they're always getting shuffled around. This is essentially to avoid a particular minority of validators actually being able to get together with a scheme to break the parachain. There are a couple of other types of participants, collators and fishermen. I'll go into those in a second. And the other thing to note about the diagram is that the idea that there's a bridge. So what we can do, particularly with systems like Ethereum, which are relatively flexible, is that we can basically give the validators a multi-signature account in an external system and allow these guys to act as a proxy so that they can forward messages into this external system. And in principle, through logging mechanisms, actually forward messages back again into Polkadot from the system. Now, there's a small issue with this. It's actually quite a large issue, which is the finalization, the canonicalization mechanisms are different. So, for example, Ethereum uses a proof of work finalization mechanism, whereas Polkadot would use a BFT proof of stake finalization. Now, if these two decide that that the Ethereum block at some particular height was different to the other, if it comes into a different canonicalization of this, then you've got a big problem because the transactions that you might have processed in Polkadot, Ethereum doesn't think actually ever happened. A way to get around this is to do basically what exchanges do and leave it for X blocks, maybe 1,000 blocks, before you actually decide whether yes, Ethereum did indeed process that block. So before treating these transactions as being canonical, you give them some time to age and finalize. So who actually maintains it? The idea is that there's these kind of four groups, four roles within the network. The first role is validators, and I've actually put the nominators next to them because they form, they're kind of the same set of participants. And these guys just take blocks and vote to say whether they think they're valid and whether they eventually finalise it. Collators are the guys that actually sit on a particular parachain, so they're specialised to a parachain, and they run a full node of that parachain. So what they're able to do is to provide candidates to the nominators. Now the candidates that they provide are not, they don't have any kind of stake proved or any authority proved or any work or anything like that proved. Actually they prove one thing, they prove that the block that they're given is valid. This is up to the validators to actually check. So the validators get given a candidate block with a proof of validity. The proof of validity will take the form of basically a whole load of Merkle nodes, at least in a system that's very local tree based like Ethereum. We'll take all these Merkle nodes and build a partial Merkle tree that would enable them to actually execute all of the transactions of the block and determine what the correct final state of the system is. And they would check to ensure that that was indeed the case. Finally, there are these notion of kind of fishermen. Fishermen, they're called fishermen because they're always looking out for that one big catch. So these guys are basically the freelance bounty hunters, the freelance police. And what they do is they basically process everything, probably sitting on one or two or three parachains, and they process everything going along. If they see anything that's any misbehavior, notably a validator who is validating something that's incorrect, then they can flag it to the other validators and start a process where ultimately they can claim that they helped find a malevolent actor. That's more or less the same thing. So why do these guys act as they do? Well, basically, the validators do so through their activity is recognised by virtue of their stake increasing. So what we do is as we account for all of the participants' stake in the network, we increase the stake of those that are actually taking part to maintain the network. In the case of collators, they would actually collect transaction fees, so real fees from the parachains that they're helping to collate. Now these fees are not huge. They're probably, we're probably talking, at least in something like Ethereum, to be something like between 10 and 50 cents per block. But that's still a reasonably good collection if all you have to do is fire up a relatively cheap server with good connectivity and they go great. And finally, the fishermen are the ones that are holding out for that one big catch. Right? So they're running nodes, they're not really doing anything else, but they're able to get a really great prize if they do find any wrongdoing happening on the network. So this is one of the more difficult aspects of Polkadot. How do we actually come to consensus and do so in a way that's scalable? Well, the first thing to understand is that the relay chain itself runs a proof of stake algorithm, which is basically like a Byzantine fault-tolerant mechanism. We assume that around just over 2/3 of the nodes are actually going to be benevolent or at least fair acted. And we have a means of coming to consensus whereby each of the parachains individually form consensus at the same time, and then finally, in a sort of a finalization stage, the relay chain block itself has consensus formed around each of the individual parachain states. The basic way that we form the underlying validator group is through this proof of stake mechanism, whereby individual owners would put up bonds measured in terms of this overall stake accounting metric, and those that place a bond that do not themselves want to validate, or perhaps do want to validate, but others are actually outbidding them, would allow, would use an approval voting mechanism so that they can approve of other validators or other potential validators in the whole bonded community. We use a constraint optimizer in order to ensure that basically when all is resolved, the validators that we have are obviously themselves have bonded, and anyone who approves of them, if we sum all of that together and we look at the minimum bonded validator, then that is optimal, that's maximized. And then on top of that, we want to minimize the total, let's say, reduction of everybody who is not validating. We want to reduce that, the amount, or minimize the amount that we are reducing their staking metric, or the staking tokens. Finally, these rewards are adaptive in order to target a very particular number of, or amount of the staking metric that is bonded. But just to say, basically, we decide how much security we want. We say, well, we want 50% of the supposed network value to be actually active under the securing, under this validation system, and that's what we target. Okay, so as part of the consensus mechanism, we have to ensure that parachains themselves are validated. Now, part of this is relatively easy. We just have that each validator assigned to a random parachain, and they just get a bunch of potential candidates with a proof of validity that's been helpfully collated for them by these collator guys, and they check that it's valid. Okay, that's so far so good. The critical thing here is that we have to ensure that the external data that runs into these blocks, that makes the block valid, right, for which validity cannot be checked otherwise. We need to ensure that external data is available, like at least for a while in the future, so that other participants of the network can themselves check that the validators have been doing their job correctly. Because if we get, all of the validators of a subgroup assigned to a particular parachain, if they're compromised, then they could invent external data, invalid external data, keep it secret or not create it at all, and declare that the correct operation given this external data is a bunch of transactions coming out that purport to transfer an awful lot of value where it shouldn't go. Okay? So it's very important that this external data can actually be checked. That's performed as part of the proof of validity. This is basically voted upon by the rest of the validators in some particular manner, so that the rest of the validators kind of sign off that the data is indeed available, and this can then be checked as part of and complaints can be registered by the collators if the data, it turns out, is not available when the validators had said that it was. So relaying transactions basically takes two forms here. So the transactions that are going between parachains boil down to two stages, with each with their own ways of getting the data for data logistics. So the first stage is to look after the consensus critical portions of this. So what we do is we maintain queues. The queues are using a Merkle tree data structure in order that we can form proofs that after one particular state of the network with this particular configuration of outgoing queues, maybe some previous incoming queues, on the next frame or next block, after the queues have been processed and the messages shuffled around, that we have these outgoing queues and these incoming queues. Now, these are registered, the roots of these trees are registered by the validators, and then again, fishermen or collators can potentially complain if they believe that queues have been misadministered, so maybe messages have been dropped, reordered, or added. If they can prove by virtue of Merkle roots and proofs coming off these that there is indeed been misbehaviour going on with the delivery of messages, then there can be a bond reduction or indeed exilement Now that looks after coming to a consensus on which messages should go where in principle, but it doesn't actually manage any of the data delivery. So the data delivery happens separately over on the network level, whereby peers are actually pre-connect to the potential destinations that they need to be sending messages to, and arrange delivery in advance. So how do we manage availability? So availability is the issue I mentioned before, whereby it's very important that we actually have the data that we need to validate blocks, that data is available and stays available at least for a reasonable period of time. Essentially, this boils down to collators policing data availability. So collators, if you remember, collators sit on parachains, right? So they don't move; they just stay on a particular parachain and contain a full node of that parachain. Yeah. So this is basically when Bitcoin miners sit on the Bitcoin network or Ethereum sit on the Ethereum network, they maintain full nodes similarly. They look out for transactions, they collate them together, they create potential block candidates, they send it off to validation. And eventually, when the block is validated and finalized, they add that to their chain and start all over again. Now, the problem is that if a collator doesn't have the previous block's data available, then they cannot create a new block, they cannot create a new candidate, they can't add it to their chain and maintain their full node. Why? Because they can't process the transactions. They can't process the transactions. If they can't do that, then they can't update their tree structure, their state, and so they can't actually process new transactions. This is good. This gives us an ability to say, right, well, these guys are fundamentally incentivized to ensure that the data is available on their particular parachain. So we rely on this. And what we do is we say, if anyone has been a collator in the last X blocks, or X might be maybe 1,000 or 10,000, then we allow them to complain directly to a validator and say, well, hold on, these guys said the data was available, but when I asked them for it, they don't give it to me. And then that validator that they're complaining to can actually check them. And if they don't give it to that validator either, then there's a problem, and we can actually escalate it to the point of getting the entire network to vote on it. And if the entire network decides that the data wasn't available, then they can ultimately punish the validator that is withholding it, or that never had it in the first place, and ensure that they can't repeat the folly. Now, inevitably, most of the time there'll be like network issues, and actually the data will be deliverable, it will exist, and the validator will say, oh, well, sorry, it didn't connect to me, or it was just a slow connection or something. That's fine, but then you need to create this kind of mild punishment for the parties just to ensure that if there's griefing going on, where actually what they're planning is to reduce the desire for everyone to be checking on them in order to prepare the ground for a later attack, you still need to actually have a mild and probably cumulative punishment. So this kind of brings us on to ensuring fairness, because it's very important to ensure in this case that collators, if we're relying on them, then we want to ensure that there's at least one or two benevolent collators, and it's impossible to just wash away all the benevolent ones with malevolent ones in order to form an attack if you can get the validators, you can pay them off at any particular time. So what do? Well, we actually take a leaf out of the proof of works book, and we create the notion of the golden ticket. So the golden ticket is basically an address which is favoured above all other addresses, and the closer you get to this address, the better, the more likely it is that it will be your candidate that gets through and becomes the eventual finalised candidate for that particular block. We create a random address for each parachain, for each block. The validator that actually gets the winning, proposes a candidate whose collator has signed it, whose collator is closest to that address, gets a slightly larger reward. So this does incentivizes validators to back collators who are close to this golden ticket. This magic address. What stops a collator from just having loads and loads of addresses? Well, they would have to basically send many different. So bandwidth is one issue. They would have to send many different potential things to validators. The other. There is another issue, but I'll go into that later if someone wants to ask it. There's one final important thing to go over, and this is the notion of how parachains can be, what different kinds of parachains that the system might support. So everything that I've told you so far is really concentrated on the basic notion of a parachain that's just kind of processing transactions that all validation functions, all about mimicking what blockchains already do. So it's what I would call a parachain that's strongly tied to the rest of Polkadot. It's possible to have much more weakly tied parachains. So these are the sorts of parachains that you might see, where you already have a set of authorities, or maybe you're a consortium and you have a bunch of nodes that you're happy actually to kind of trust within your community, but you still want to take part in the Polkadot network. You still want that network effect. In this sense, what you can do is say, well, we're happy to use the Polkadot network's consensus mechanism, finalization mechanism, because that doesn't really impose on us at all, but we don't want the Polkadot network's validators being the ones that validate our transactions. Right? What we want to do is basically be able to sign off on our transactions and our state transition that follows them, and just get the Polkadot network to check that they're signed off before it actually finalizes and canonicalizes these blocks. And that's perfectly valid. Now, what this does is it's quite interesting because it opens the door to a bunch of other stuff. If the only thing that the validators have to do is check a bunch of signatures, then the block itself can be in principle kind of encrypted or with relatively minimal access for the validators to look at. It in principle opens the door to things like encrypted private chains that sit within an organizational entity or a business or consortium, and allow the consortium or business to go about its maintenance so that it can actually use it for internal mechanisms. But it will allow the sending and receiving of messages with the rest of the system in a trust-free manner. So basically, it's automatically going to be able to place services for other blockchains, other contracts that sit on blockchains, other on-chain systems to interact with. So we can imagine something, perhaps, just to give a basic idea, something like a KYC or AML system that's actually hosted by some bank or financial or even government agency, and allow it to provide an on-chain service to various other blockchains that themselves are maybe operating in public, they're very open systems, maybe something like Ethereum. And then a contract on Ethereum could actually require that this government-owned, encrypted, very much private service interact with it in a very particular way. So it's where this account holder must be able to prove that they actually are a citizen of this country, or they're of this particular age, or whatever it is, and they can do that without actually giving away any particular privacy, and are basically operating within the current constraints of modern-day organizations. Now, in principle, you can also do things like bridged chains. So bridged chains, I sort of mentioned a little bit earlier. This is where you take a legacy system, so something like Ethereum, maybe even other networks, probably already existing. What's critical about them is that they have their own finalization, their own consensus mechanism. So they're kind of happy going about this on their own. And what we do is we make a stub. So we say, right, there's not actually a full parachain behind this. There's not, the validation function is relatively minimal. The collators don't really do anything. There are no collators probably. But what happens is that the maintainers of this parachain, as they are looking at this external parachain, this external blockchain, and forwarding messages to and from, and providing validation proofs only after a particular period has passed, so we can ensure that any accidental reorganizations or reversions that happen in this external chain don't have any lasting problematic effects within Polkadot, and vice versa. Okay, that's been a reasonably whirlwind tour. Are we doing questions? Yeah.
Take a couple of questions.
You told us Fisherman will check for something like misbehavior, right? So they will stop any attempt of money laundering. fisherman will check misbehavioral cases. So does it mean that they will stop any attempts of money laundering?
Ah, I see. No. So the critical thing that fishermen are checking is that the consensus mechanism, particularly the validation functions, are working correctly. So when we say misbehavior, really what I'm talking about is misbehavior of the validators, of the participants in the system that are checking that the transactions are doing what they're meant to be doing.
Could you outline a sort of use case that you envisage? I know you said KYC, for example, but something that would really resonate. Maybe.
I mean, one of the big challenges we've had is how, if we want to really create software that enables decentralized asset management, the only way currently to communicate or to hold assets on from different chains is to use a bridge, a centralized bridge like an exchange, which ideally, if you're having a truly decentralized project, you want to avoid. So for us, Polkadot, that's one of the issues Polkadot solves. But it's not limited to that. I think you can envision, if you envision that all sorts of things can be done on all these different blockchains, there's anything, any data, KYC, AML, or anything that's being built on other blockchains essentially can be transmitted now. Not now, hopefully will be able to be transmitted via Polkadot. So essentially Polkadot allows the secure transfer of any data or information on any big parachain.
But on an interactive basis, as it were, I forgot the word, where, for example, settlement, delivery versus payment, where you give up something in exchange for cash in the current day, but let's say you're giving up the security of one store of value for another. Does it happen concurrently, for example? Is that the way it works?
Yeah, so there are various structures that we could create as the middleware, right? So this isn't looked after by the underlying protocol, because the underlying protocol doesn't know about things like tokens, right? It's entirely well, it doesn't care, right? It's ambivalent about it. What it cares about is ensuring this validation function is executed, returns true for any of the history of any of these parachains. So, but what we can do is we can guarantee that messages are sent, they're delivered properly, that they are not corrupted anyway, and that when they say they are from a particular point, that they really are from, and that if one message is sent, precisely one message arrives. And we can also say that when they arrive, that the system will execute as you expect it to. Now, that can obviously change for different parachains, because different parachains might have different expectations of what transactions are going to do. But in principle, they will work as described or as stated, so the semantics are rigid and they're solid. Now, what does this mean in reality? Well, it means that we can it's basically like having a bunch of computers and they're all networked and they can run whatever software that we want. And some of the computers can look kind of different. We have different CPUs and different memories and different hard drives and all the rest of it. They can do all sorts of different cool things. And as the computers get better and better and better, we can network those in as well. And programs will be running on the computers. And sometimes we'll be able to see what the programs are and know for sure that those programs will stay exactly running as they are. And sometimes we won't be able to see what they are, but we know who's operating the computer and we want to interact with it anyway. And these can all be sitting around kind of in the ether, on this internet blockchain sort of thing. And they will, when we deploy our computer or when we find someone who's got a computer that we want to use, we can deploy our thing to it and it will be able to use the services that are all offered on all these different computers. So, I can outline ways that we could do things like, atomic token transfers and swaps and requiring that a sale can go through if and only if one of these three things requires that, says that the KYC has been done. I can say, well, actually, we can create a decentralized hedge fund. What we can do is say, well, you can invest or you must invest in equal parts of all of these things, but only the ones for which 2 of the 3 credit rating agencies say give a particular rating and above or beyond that. I can say, well, this particular contract will invest in all of these things, but if and only, or all of these government bonds, but if and only if the interest rate at a particular time is at least this much, no more than this much. So the nice thing about it is that we can say all of these kind of cases where we've got different things going on, maybe hefty data delivery, requirement of private individuals, requirement for open or public open public networks, really maybe experimental features that we need in blockchain, like zero knowledge proofs for guaranteeing privacy, requirements that interact with particular legacy systems. We can actually bring all of this together, and that's really how it is.
So can I assume this you can interconnect, like for example, private chain Ethereum to mainnet Ethereum? You can send a transaction, correct?
This is one of the things that the protocol proposes.
Yeah. Then if I'm in private chain and if I say based on some activity private, because I want to keep it private, I want to send some reward from this address to this address in public chain. Can you do that?
That's the idea.
And then in that case, if I'm sending some transaction from a private chain, at some point it goes to the public chain, which has kind of financial value.
Which has what?
So like if you send transaction, you have to pay the gas. So the financial value and stuff. So how does the price conversion happen?
So the means so in principle, what Polkadot looks after is the fact that these messages do arrive and they're otherwise unperturbed. Right? So you can fire off the message and you'll be guaranteed that the destination parachain will look at it at least, but you can't actually guarantee that anything else will happen. So you have to incentivize the destination parachain in some instances to actually execute them or do something about the message. So this will be in Ethereum sort of language, this will be the gas payment. Yeah. Now, how would this actually work? Well, in principle, you would set up a contract on both the eventual destination parachain and the source parachain, and these contracts would recognize each other. So they would either do it automatically by virtue of their code, they would check the code hash and make sure that the code was a particular code hash that they recognise, so they could be guaranteed with the operation, or perhaps when the chain is deployed, they would automatically create these things and sort of feed it in to both so they actually knew about which it would address. Now these guys would maintain in much of the, I think, like corresponding banking, but basically these guys would maintain what they know the other ones owes them in terms of some particular token or currency or whatever value. In the case of Ethereum, of course, it would be. So basically, what you're starting to get is would be an Ether holding contract on the parachain that wants to send to Ethereum, and then you would this Ether holding contract would itself hold Ether by proxy within Ethereum. Yeah? So in principle, this contract actually does control real Ether, and it can send it if it wants to just by sending a message to Ethereum. So that contract, in some sense, has a representation of an account that is really physically in Ethereum. So now what we can do is interact with Ether within in the parachain. And what we do is we just say, well, the contract actually wants to send the transaction to Ethereum, would own some Ether, so it would actually, in some sense, purchase or whatever, but it would actually hold some of the Ether in that the contract that is in principle a mirror contract of the Ether, and it would use that contract to forward the message. So it would send the message first to that contract, and that contract would then, because it actually holds Ether on the real Ethereum chain, would effectively would send a real Ethereum message that could be paid for by the Ethereum chain, and proxy the message that they want to send it to through to that sort of mirror contract, yeah, what we call a break-in contract, And then that break-in contract would then proxy the message on to its real destination in Ethereum, paying the gas that you want, because it actually has ether that's held directly on the chain. So it's a bit complicated, but this is something that only has to be set up once, and then that infrastructure is there. But critically, it's at the middleware portion. So it's not implemented as part of Polkadot, it will be deployed on Polkadot. Maybe one more.
We'll do one more, and then I think we'll be around for a few minutes afterwards if anyone wants to take questions offline.
Just a couple of quick questions around security, if you're doing okay. So, just with the validators, is it possible that if perform well, they increase their stake, and then they can, the various validators that perform well with the increased stake can collaborate with their increased stake to then maybe compromise the system? And then also with the migration of labels and fishermen, is there some kind of underlying assumption there that because you have to reward them in some form, that cost is cheaper than, say, a non-blockchain security system? Because there is a cost there, which I'm interested in. And just lastly, very quickly, because you have fishermen and so forth looking out for errors, is there an assumption here that there are potential errors and that only the solution is as n people in the network gets large enough, errors or security issues disappear? So really the underlying assumption is a large amount of people in a large network, which may be allowing entry for the new chains.
Right. So the first question.
Sorry about
yeah, there's an assumption that that no more than about a third of the validators are going to be licensed. So, in principle, if you end up with a situation that there's like ends up with one big validator that owns everything, that owns 34% of the total staking tokens, then you do have a problem. So, absolutely, the underlying stakeholder base must be reasonably decentralized to have a Now, the idea is that the amounts that the stakeholders stake is increased by virtue of taking part in the validation system is not like, massive. It's not that, one month will pass and someone's going to end up with 80% of the total tokens because it's not the best way to pay them. No, rather, the idea is that the validation, the security requirements for the validators won't require a vast amount of minting of new stake in any one particular place, but rather it'll be spread out amongst hopefully a very large proportion of the existing validator and stakeholder set, so maybe 80%. So basically, we try and involve as many stakeholders as possible in order to ensure that any of the inflation of stake is done for most of the participants in the system, and very few are being reduced in stature because they're not taking part. The second thing about the collators being paid in transaction fees, I mean, this is in principle, validators could sort of pay for the block candidates by giving some of maybe their rewards or whatever to the collators. But I think in principle, given that the setup that collators need to do in order to process the transactions, when we see Ethereum, for example, which would be a similar setup, we see maybe 5,000-6,000 nodes that are just sitting on the network, processing all of the transactions, technically being validators, right? They're actually bringing these things through, and if they find something different, they'll fall back into their own theory. So, is it too much to expect that actually this is a fairly kind of normal expectation for the parachains? Maybe 1,000-2,000 collators that would just sit around collating transactions, especially if we engineer the system in order to give them a fighting chance of being able to get a few cents now and again from actually being the winning block candidate. Surely it's something to model beforehand, but I think there's, it's not an incredibly unreasonable. Third question. I forgot the third question.
Yeah, so just lastly, is the entire system dependent on large networks?
So certainly it's dependent on participants doing their job. In principle, if the parachains are doing something useful, the participants will probably be there. Partly because if I'm doing something that I depend on the parachains to operate, so for example, in a real world existing sort of thing, if I'm a Bitcoin company, I'm going to run a full Bitcoin node. I'm not going to do all my stuff on a light. I mean, I might do production stuff, possibly on a light client, wallet sort of solution, but I'm almost certainly going to be running one or two full nodes just to check that actually Bitcoin itself is running properly, because I depend on it too much. So I suspect that it's again the same sort of thing. If anyone is actually really deploying anything useful to these parachains, they're probably going to run a node. And by the way, the idea of like fishermen and collators, this isn't something that they would have to go out of the way to do. The idea is that basically if you run a node, you automatically become a collator and a fisherman. So you're automatically looking out for invalid stuff and you'll report it if you see it. And it only takes one fisherman to flag something for the rest of the validators to be notified. So it's a relatively kind of easy thing to deliver. It's very difficult to hide something that's for which an open proof exists. So I don't think it's going to require thousands of nodes in order to do that.
Okay, guys, we're going to have to stop there. Thanks very much to UCL, the Blockchain and Cryptographic Society, thanks to CBT, thanks to Gavin for coming, and I think we'll be around